I used to work at this corner pub in a small Minnesota town. More of a bistro, I suppose, but it was always called a pub. I mostly handled orders, cleaning, and mixing the occasional drink. I was pretty much the only one working there apart from the two owners. They were an older couple in their 70s. I thought about looking for another job, but the owners had made it clear that if I stayed and helped out, I'd be the first in line to buy the place for cheap once they had retired. It was a pretty good deal, I thought. But working in a place like that takes some time getting used to. There are plenty of locals to get to know, and you have to understand who's who and who does what. And while most of these people are harmless and quirky, there was that one couple who just rubbed me the wrong way. I want to share my experience with these people. For some, consider this a warning. For others, it might answer a couple of questions you didn't know you had. Now, Pat and Angela Fisher were a couple of locals who only showed up once per year. They usually kept to themselves. You might spot one of them out shopping for groceries or getting gas for their car, but they weren't really the socializing type. There'd been a lot of speculation as to what their deal really was. Some thought they were religious nutcases, while others thought they might hold some extreme political views. Personally, I was not sure. They seemed harmless enough. The Fishers visit our pub once per year. They get dressed up and go out for a bite to eat. Those who lived in this town long enough know that they do have a daughter, Elena, but she never goes out with them, not even on nice nights like this. You can see her as you drive by the house sometimes, but most people have no idea they even have a child. I'd worked at the pub for 5 years when once again the Fishers walked in. Pat had dressed up in a brown blazer with a black shirt, while Angela had this plain white summer dress, and as always, Elena was not with them. Still, it seemed to be some kind of special occasion. I walked up to them and tried making some small talk about being dressed up and wished them a lovely evening. They gave me nothing to work with, no hint at what they were doing or why. They just ordered their meal and sat in silence, looking out the window. I snuck back into the kitchen and mentioned it to the owners. They rolled their eyes at me. "They've done this for years, since the girl was born," the old woman said. "I think it's a birthday thing." I let my curiosity get the better of me. My final interaction with the couple was casually asking them how Elena was doing. Without skipping a beat, Angela answered she didn't even look up from the table. "She's fine, everything's fine." And that was that, discussion over. The Fishers had a simple meal and a glass of red wine each. As soon as they finished, they paid with cash, gave a decent enough tip, and left. They seemed to be in a hurry, so I tried my best not to get in their way. Still, I couldn't help being curious. Everyone knows there is something strange about the Fishers, but no one really knows what or why. As we closed for the night, I cleaned out the booth where the Fishers had been sitting. I noticed something unusual. Angela's purse. She'd put it aside at the beginning of the meal and must have forgotten about it. I was going to return it, obviously, but a part of me couldn't help but look a bit closer. Maybe there was a hint as to what their deal was. I'm not proud of it, but I rummaged through her purse. But there wasn't much. A written phone number to some guy named Tom, a couple of loose bills, some makeup, tissues, a couple of hundreds in loose bills. That was pretty much it. No phone. I decided I'd give it back to them that same evening. I was feeling a bit guilty about looking through their personal belongings and figured I'd do something nice. Maybe they were just an odd couple. Maybe I was just being judgmental. After my shift, I got in my sky blue Nissan and made my way to the Fisher's house. I see it every time I go to work. It's not too far off my route. It was about 10 p.m. when I stopped in their driveway. I figured I'd just be in and out, so I didn't bother to lock it. I left it in the driveway along with my take-home leftovers. I left my phone there too, it was charging, so I didn't see the need for it. The Fishers had a nice home, a large 2-story house with a separate garage and a small guest house out back. I've always loved the color of it, a mellow green with white edges. Kinda clashed a bit with the blue sunflowers in the front garden though. The moment I reached their door, I could hear a rumble in the sky. It was shaping up to be a very rainy night. I looked for a doorbell, but couldn't find one, so I knocked on the door. Something in the air shifted. Sudden lack of sound, as if there had been a noise coming from inside that I only barely registered, which stopped with my knock. Were they talking? Pat opened the door a bit, but it was stopped by the chain. His eyes went wide. I immediately got the impression there was some urgency to this. "Yes," he said. "Just here to give you back your missus's purse," I smiled. "You forgot it at the—" "Yes, of course," he interrupted. "Thank you." He reached out and grabbed it through the gap in the door. Just as he was about to close the door, I heard a screech of a chair being suddenly moved across the floor. I caught a glimpse of someone, then the door slammed in my face. I figured it was just Elena in the background, so without thinking too much about it, I blurted out, "Good to see you, Elena. Have a good one." I turned to go back to my car before the rain came, but there was a click at the door. Pat threw the door wide open, calling out to me. "Wait," he said. Sorry, I was being rude. I'm sorry about that." "No problem," I shrugged. You'll have a good one." No, I can't accept that," he chuckled. Why don't you come in? We're having a rhubarb pie." That's right, thank you." I'm sure Elena would appreciate the company." I had another look at him, and then back at my car. Every polite bone in my body was screaming at me to just accept. But another part of me just wanted to leave. Even now, I couldn't help but to think there was something off about the Fishers, even at the expense of homemade rhubarb pie. Tell her I say hi," I smiled, and got back in my car. The rain was coming. I saw Pat get back inside the house. As I put the keys in and fiddled around with the wipers, I made sure the alarm was off. It can be a bit glitchy sometimes. Looking straight ahead, I noticed Pat Fisher coming outside, holding something. Someone was screaming from inside the house. "Honey, wait, don't!" Pat Fisher raised a pump-action shotgun, and my ears were ringing before I saw the muzzle flash. I threw up my hands as a barrage of shotgun shells blew holes into the hood of my car. Moments later, the car door flew open. I was staring down the barrel of a gun with an anxious Pat Fisher on the other end. He was close enough for me to see the specks of rain on his glasses. "Out!" he screamed. "Out now!" His wife was standing in the doorway, screaming herself hoarse. I just held my arms over my head, kept my face down, and did as I was told. My ears were screaming. It was as if something inside my ears had been cut by the noise of ripped metal. "We can't do this," Angela screamed. "We can't do this, it's too soon." "What choice do we have?" Pat screamed back. "She saw her. She fucking saw her." It's as if my legs had forgotten they could move, so Pat dragged me out by the ponytail. Cold mud soaked into my pants as my knees hit the ground and I was pulled away. With a gun barrel pressing into my lower back, he pushed me forward, back towards the house. Now in the moment, I couldn't really focus. My mind was running circles around me, trying to figure out what the hell was going on. But looking back at it, there was really nothing to give away just how strange the Fishers really were. There were pictures on the walls, a sign in the kitchen expressing love for the home, neatly vacuumed carpets, and a well-worn wallpaper. They'd lived there for a long time, and it showed. But in a way that makes you think of a proper home, and now the illusion was shattered. I was pushed to the floor, my muddy jeans staining the flowery hallway carpet. "We've got years left, Pat. Years," Angela cried. "We can't do this now." "It's too late, and we're dealing with it," Pat screamed back. "If you just kept her in the kitchen, we wouldn't be—" They both quieted down and looked around. Angela hurried down the back corridor into the washing room. Moments later, there was a struggle, someone pleading and Angela protesting in turn. Pat was anxious to go help, but he couldn't let me out of his sight. Instead, he just stood there, calling out to his wife. Seconds later, Angela returned. She had wrapped her arms around Elena, who looked to be around 14, maybe 15 years old. She had shoulder-length brown hair, a black t-shirt, and a pair of faded jeans. This was probably the first time I'd seen her up close. Elena was screaming at her mother to let her go, while Angela tried desperately to calm her down, hushing and hugging her. Elena was having none of it. There, sweet summer child," Angela groaned. There. After a short struggle, Elena realized she was going nowhere. For a moment, we'd all just stopped. The hallway echoed with the struggling breaths as we all looked at one another. Angela still having her arms wrapped around her daughter. "Upstairs," said Pat, one at a time. Elena looked at Pat in complete disbelief. Then she noticed the shotgun. Her eyes widened. She didn't say anything as the two of us were slowly led upstairs. Angela stayed behind her husband, peering over his shoulder. "We'll figure this out," Angela pleaded. "It'll all be okay. Just give us a minute, okay? I didn't say anything. I just looked back at Elena, who seemed as confused as I was. We were pushed into a small guest room on the top floor. I could tell someone had been living there for some time. The air was stale, but most notable were the iron bars welded into the window. They had no intention of letting us out of the room anytime soon. The moment we stepped inside, Angela apologized as the door slammed shut. There was a set of locks on the outside, all clicking, one by one. As the rain outside kicked up, we could hear the wind howling. The house groaned as it withstood the pressure, causing little creaks and cracking in the wall and ceiling. Elena sank down onto her bed, burying her face in her hands as I reached for my cell phone, only to realize I had left it charging in the passenger seat of the car, right next to my leftover dinner. "Do you know these people?" Elena asked. It took me a moment to register her question. I looked at her, trying to understand. Yeah, I said, "Don't you?" Turns out this wasn't Elena Fisher. This was a girl named River. She was 14 years old and originally came from a small county just north of Phoenix, Arizona. She had only known the Fishers for a couple of weeks. Turns out she'd been abducted. She had no idea what was going on, but at least she was unharmed. According to River, there was no one else in the house. There was no Elena, and she couldn't understand why everyone was calling her that. She tried to get out, but the Fishers had the place on lockdown. "I have no idea why they're doing this," she admitted. "I have no idea. They don't tell me anything." Have they taken anyone else?" I asked. "Anyone but you and me?" She shook her head. "But I hear them talking sometimes," she said. "Look." She leaned against the far wall, pressing her ear against it. I followed her lead, and I could hear muffled voices from down below. There had to be some sort of ventilation leading past the kitchen, carrying their voices through the walls. Pat and Angela were talking about something being too soon, and mentioned something about 4 years left. I tried to piece it together. I looked around the room. It was a repurposed childhood room, it seemed. The wallpaper was still brightly colored butterflies, and there were little notches on the side of the doorframe, the kind you make to check how much someone has grown year by year. But the notches stopped after 3 years. After that, nothing. Considering everything I had heard about Elena Fisher, she was a pale young girl with shoulder-length brown hair. But that was pretty much the extent of what I knew. River fit that category really well, but so did a lot of girls. "They said they would let me go," River explained. "I just have to stay a little longer." "Did they say how long?" A couple of weeks," she sighed. "But that was weeks ago." "Wait, you were here all day while they were out for dinner?" "They locked me in the bathroom," she nodded. They were going to meet someone, and then they were going out. Seemed like a big deal. The note in Angela's purse came to mind. This Tom fellow, an accomplice maybe? About half an hour passed, then suddenly there were footsteps coming up the stairs. I could hear Angela pleading and Pat responding. "Yes," he yelled back and down. "We can't." "But why can't? Just..." My head was rushing in 3 directions at once. "We can't keep her for 4 years," he yelled back down. "We can't." But we can just... My head was rushing in 3 directions at once. I thought about hiding, attacking, rushing past him, but ultimately I did nothing. River and I just lined up against the wall as far away from the door as possible. When Pat entered, I could tell he was unstable. His hands were shaking and he had his finger on the trigger. "You," he said, nodding at me. "Out now!" Angela stood to the side, her arms crossed. Pat led me downstairs and out the door, through the washing room. No one said a word. By now the rain was pouring down. My hair got stuck in my face, stinging my eyes. The ground smelled of wet dirt, some sort of chemical, maybe ammonia. The rain was relentless. I could hear Angela calling something out from the house, but I couldn't hear what. Pat cocked the shotgun and spoke, seemingly to himself. "We've gone too far to stop now," he said. "We can't stop now." I looked up at him, only to see the gun pointed my way. This was it. He was doing it. In the final moment, my mind was just racing with possibilities and last-second attempts. But I couldn't bring myself to believe that this was actually happening. I was locked into this role of an onlooker, seeing myself through my own eyes, incapable of believing I was the one on the chopping block. His eyes locked with mine. He was terrified. Angela called out again, and Pat's eyes darted to the side. She repeated something. His eyes wavered as he looked back at her. "What?" "He can use her," she called back. We can give her to him, and he can use her." Why?" Angela was hurrying outside, covering her head with a jacket. As she ran up to Pat, I tried to get out the dirt, but he just turned his attention right back to me. I couldn't provoke him further. If he can take her, we don't have to worry. We don't have to deal with this." "And what if he doesn't?" Then we will deal with it," Angela nodded. But if we don't have to, that's... Yeah, Pat sighed. "Yeah, that's good. We'll do that." As the two of them spoke, I looked around. We were in the backyard. At first I thought it was a garden, but something was growing. There were little wooden markers placed in rows of 5, for a total of 10. All of them numbered from 4 to 13. I looked down, pressing my hand into the dirt. Not too far to my right was another marker with a 14 written. The soil there was harder, and there was a shovel resting next to it. What the hell have they done? I was led back inside. Angela was standing off to the side, rocking back and forth. I could tell she was stressed out of her mind. She was looking at something on the wall, a wooden mallet, a one-handed wooden mallet, hanging right over the washing machine. It had 10 black notches on the handle, same number as the markers out back. "Sweet summer child," she wept. "You're coming home, sweet summer child." I was led back upstairs, and Pat threw a towel at me to dry off with. As I was reunited with River, I couldn't stop myself from weeping. All the fear that I'd been putting on hit me like a truck. The entire body felt like it was shutting down. It was just this all-consuming, singular, focused fear. To go from this distorting mindset to the full realization of what had been about to happen is unreal. I told River all I'd seen out there, the markers, the mallet, and taking everything into account, I tried to summarize my thoughts. They were doing something they had done before, possibly as many as 10 times. They were going to do it again, and possibly up to 4 more times. They had some kind of accomplice. All these bits and pieces were starting to paint a picture. River was barely paying attention as she looked out the window, shaking her head. "Don't you get it?" she said shakily. "Just look. What does it look like?" I moved over to the window and looked outside. Neat rows, the 5 markers each. It could just be one thing. "Graves," I said. "It looks like graves." We had to do something, anything, and as a bolt of lightning sailed across the sky, River had an idea. We counted down the seconds until we heard the thunderclap. Then, with the River as a spotter, we carefully flipped a chair at the far end of the room, got ready. Timed with the next thunderclap, I broke off one of the chair legs, a makeshift weapon, if anything. River pointed out that the storm was moving too much. We had to skip the next strike, as we couldn't figure out the timing. But the third strike, we broke off one more leg. Leaning against the wall earlier, I realized that it was pretty thin. We took off our shoes and used the chair legs as a sort of chisel. One of the walls was made of gypsum, so there was a chance we might be able to punch a hole into the next room over. But we had to be clever about it, counting down the seconds, striking at once, and being sure to count every other strike. We had to be slow, methodical, and precise. It took some time, but the storm wasn't going away anytime soon. We managed to punch a hole through the next room, just large enough for River to crawl through. Seconds later, she'd gone around and unlocked the door from the outside. I made my way out quietly. There was no doubt in my mind that Pat would shoot the two of us if he saw us. But before I could do anything else, River showed me the room she crawled into, a small storage space. Apart from the occasional piece of furniture, most of the things in there were meant for a small child or a toddler. I wasn't surprised, but River was pointing out something specific. Pile of picture frames. Elena, 1 year old. Elena, 2 years old. And Elena, 3 years old. Then nothing. She didn't make it to 4, River whispered. So what did they? We both fell silent. There was more to this, but I couldn't figure it out. Not yet. We could hear them talking downstairs, something about a stranger showing up in the morning. Just one more night, Angela pleaded. Pat wasn't convinced, but reluctantly seemed to agree. As they talked, we considered going through one of the windows, making our way to the end of the upstairs hallway. We found the Bishop's bedroom, all neatly organized and clean. We snuck up in the window and cracked it open. Using my arm, I helped River climb out. She had to do a bit of a jump, but it wasn't all that bad, and she landed in the soft soil. But as I turned to climb out, I could hear the conversation downstairs was ending, and they were moving around. I pointed at River and waved her off, silently begging her to go get help. Then I shut the window and hurried back to the room. There was no time. I had to hide. I propped up my jacket and a pillow in the bed in the room to make it look like River was sleeping, and I hid the broken chair behind the door. I figured if I stood far enough to the right, they wouldn't see the small hole in the wall at the ground level. It was a long shot, but it just might work. But as I got back to the room, there was one thing I hadn't counted on: the lock. There was no way for me to lock the door from inside. Before I could even begin to figure it out, Angela came through the door. Angela looked over at the sleeping River and put down 2 plates of something warm alongside with a bottle of water. She looked at the door a couple of times, as if trying to make sense of what she was looking at. I think she concluded that Pat must have forgotten to lock it, and that we must have missed it. After all, why else would I still be in the room? "It'll be over by morning," Angela whispered. "I'm sorry about all this." I said nothing. I just grabbed one of the plates, poked around at it, and waited for her to leave. She did, making sure to properly lock the door. I figured I'd make another escape attempt, but Angela was waiting right outside. I could have expanded on the hole in the wall and made a way out, but the storm was moving away, and without a clear idea when there was going to be lightning, I might screw it up. Then again, what choice did I have? About an hour passed. I'd gone through 100 plans in my head, but nothing seemed plausible anymore. That I'd gotten River out, or at all, was all short of a miracle. One not very likely to be repeated, but there was a sound that snapped me out of my thoughts. A car alarm. My car alarm. Did River start it? My keys were still in the ignition after all. A moment later, there was chaos outside. someone scrambling up and down the stairs, shouting, the door slamming. I used the diversion to punch through the hole in the wall into the storage room, making my way out into the hallway. The path was clear. I decided to head back for the door. I didn't want to jump from a window and get a sprained ankle unless obviously necessary. If I had to get away in a hurry and an injury would be a death sentence. Peeking around the corner, the stairs were clear. I hurried downstairs through the washing room and out the back door, only to end up face to face with Angela Fisher standing in the rain. For a moment we just looked at one another. We didn't know what to do. My instinct was to run, hers was to call for help. But as soon as she opened her mouth, all that came out was this awful crunching noise. I hadn't noticed River sneaking up on her, wielding a garden shovel. Angela got to the back of her head bashed in. It was like turning off a light, and she was just fell, face forward, straight into the dirt. Not too far from a 14 marker. There was no time to think. I grabbed River by the hand and beelined the woods. We barely made it in the tree line before I heard this painful death wail. You never forget that kind of scream, the emotional equivalent of having your heart torn out from your chest. Pat had found his wife. Holding River by the hand, we made our way through the underbrush and into the woods. The rain made every branch, root and rock slippery. Leaves stuck to my face and clothes, but we pressed on. Every now and then, we'd hear a distant scream, sometimes coming closer, other times seeming impossibly far away. Then, a gunshot. We threw ourselves to the ground, covering our heads. We crawled to safety behind a large rock, listening intently to where the shot came from. Pat was rambling, screaming, rarely to himself. "One life for every year. That's what he wanted," he cried. "1 year until she'd be old enough to care for herself. To care for herself. Where we couldn't. We've made it this far. You can't take this away from us. You can't." River held my arm tight as we listened. We could barely hear anything over the rain, but I could tell the general direction. He was coming our way. "He comes every year, and every year we do it right. We've done it right. We're doing everything right." He was getting closer. River and I looked at one another, but there was nowhere left to go. Just getting up would expose us. All we could do was stay down and wait, hoping for Pat and the storm to pass. But we weren't so lucky. Pat stepped out next to us, panting like an animal. He turned to us, and if knowing exactly where we were hiding, despite the rain, I could tell he had been crying. He raised the shotgun towards us yet again, wailing like a wounded animal. Click. Nothing. Maybe he forgot to cock it. Maybe he was out of slugs. Either way, our hearts skipped a beat. And I burst into action. I grabbed River's shovel, got up and swung at him. The shovel connected with Pat's hand, breaking 3 fingers. A moment later, we were all in a brawl, punching, kicking, biting and strangling, and it wasn't over until River finished it with a large rock coming down on his head. Only then could I hear the rain again, but my ears kept ringing with Pat's wailing scream, long after it had been quiet. I can still hear it if I listen close enough. It was a long walk, a desperate call for help, but by morning we were safe. Now I'm sure some of you have heard this. Maybe it rings bells. The articles talked about the isolated couple who had no less than 10 bodies buried on their property. A mad way of grieving for a lost child who never made it to past 4 years old. Most of the article didn't mention kidnappings or how they were killed. I never saw my name or River's, thankfully. There was one statewide newspaper who mentioned the 2 bystanders being responsible for bringing this to the authorities' attention. Last I heard of River, she was reunited with her family back in Arizona. I'm still working at the pub. This all took place some time ago, and I've done my best not to talk too much about it or dwell on it. I still get panic attacks thinking about the gun pointed at my face. and I can still hear wailing screams at night. But apart from that, I'm okay. At least physically. But not too long ago, a man walked in. I hadn't seen him before, but he was impossible to miss. The man was at least 6'7" and wore all black, white hair, and an intense, terrifying blue eyes. He had lunch, introducing himself as Tom, and asked me a couple of brief questions about the visions. As he finished up, he smiled at me, leaving me with his final cryptic message. Some folks do anything for their sweet summer child. Jake loved the solitude of the forest. As a seasoned hiker, he relished the sense of freedom that came with trekking deep into the woods, far from civilization. It was one such trip deep within the remote reaches of the Blackwood forest that he first sensed something was amiss. At first it was just a feeling, an inexplicable chill that prickled his skin despite the warmth of the air. Then he heard it, soft whispers, just beyond the range of his hearing. He stopped and looked around and saw nothing unusual. Shrugging it off, he continued his hike, the forest closing in around him. The whispers grew louder as the day wore on, forming incoherent words that seemed to slither through the trees. Jake's steps quickened, his breath coming into shallow gasps, his surroundings beginning to warp. The trees stretched to impossible heights, their branches twisting like gnarled fingers. The path beneath his feet wavered like a mirage in the desert. Panic set in. Jake could no longer distinguish reality from illusion. He stumbled, his mind a whirlwind of fear and confusion. The whispers coalesced into a single, deafening voice that seemed to me to come everywhere and nowhere at once. You shouldn't have come here. Desperate, Jake broke into a run, the forest blurring around him. Shadows moved at the edges of his vision. Dark shapes that followed him, taunting him with their presence. His heart pounded in his chest, the drumbeat of terror. He could feel his sanity slipping away, like sand through fingers. Suddenly he burst into a clearing. The whispers ceased and the forest was eerily silent. In the center of the clearing stood a decrepit cabin, its windows dark and foreboding. Drawn by some unseen force, Jake approached the cabin. The door creaked open, revealing a single, dimly lit room. Inside he found a dusty old mirror. As he peered into it, his reflection shimmered and changed. The face staring back at him was not his own. It was gaunt, with hollow eyes and a sinister. Jake recoiled in horror, but his reflection remained, grinning wider. The whispers returned, louder than ever, and the reflection spoke in a voice that was not his own. You belong in the forest now. Jake screamed, but no sound escaped his lips. The cabin, the forest, his own mind, all of it dissolved into darkness. When he opened his eyes, he was back on the trail, the sun setting behind the trees. Had it all been a dream? As he tried to shake off the eerie experience, he heard footsteps approaching. Turning, he saw another hiker, a woman, entering the same stretch of forest. He tried to warn her, but she walked past him without a glance, as if he were invisible. Realization dawned on him with chilling clarity. He wasn't back. He was still trapped. He had become one of the whispers, a specter in the forest, doomed to wander the woods for eternity, waiting to lure the next unsuspecting soul into the depths of the Blackwood forest. A few years ago, I was moving from Cleveland to Minneapolis. It had been the worst year of my life. The man I'd been dating for the past 3 years had been involved in a scam that squandered most of our joint savings along the way. Shortly after that, I lost my job. I just couldn't keep up with the pressure of finding a new place and surviving on breadcrumbs. And I just broke down. So I decided to start over in Minneapolis. I had a couple of friends who offered me a couch to crash on for a couple of weeks. I was looking to get a new job and start over fresh. I got on the Greyhound with nothing but 2 suitcases and a handful of unread DMs. It was a long trip. Most people stopped off in Chicago and Milwaukee, so for the final stretch of the trip there was only 2 people left. And a passenger sitting across from me, a man in his early 60s. He had a kind face and spent most of his time reading messages from his friends and family. I got the impression that this was a kind of event for him. He had a fanny pack with snacks, an extra battery for his phone, sunscreen, and a tip of his ears, and a pair of Ray-Bans resting on his trucker cap. I talked to him a little. His name was Noah. He was heading from another long constellation job out of state. He was some kind of environmental. He was all about public transportation and reducing the carbon footprint. I could tell he was a jubilant fellow. I don't know a lot of people who speak so highly of their job. About half an hour from our destination, the bus suddenly lurched. There was someone standing in the middle of the road, and the driver had done his best to steer out the way. I saw a brief silhouette of someone small go by the window, possibly a child. Moments later, we were thrown into a ditch, and the bus tipped over. In the blink of an eye, all turned to chaos. I was thrown out of my seat like a slack-necked dog, and there was an awful metal groaning noise. The side of the bus was torn open. Suddenly, the world was still. My mind was spinning. I barely made it off the bus before I hurled, my inner ear screaming at me to lie down. Everything felt different. The air tasted metal. We'd driven straight into a field, leaving a long trail of bent grass and wild blue sunflowers behind us. As the engines of the bus died, all that was left was the flapping of a moth's wings. Looking back at the road, there was no one there. I couldn't see Noah or the bus driver. I picked up my phone and called the police without a second thought. I felt disorientated, and the strangest details stood out to me, like how often do you stop to look at the shape of your phone, or stop to think about the actual code you use to unlock it. While still on the phone, I was asked by the operator to check if everyone was okay. I moved to the front and saw the driver's seat was empty, and rounded the corner.
Can you see them anyway?
The operator asked again.
Is everyone alright?
I heard the noise before I saw them. This thick, meaty squash, the tearing, clicking teeth. The kindly-looking Noah was sitting a bit further out in the field, with a streak of blood trailing him. He was cradling down the driver in his arms, slowly biting off pieces from the side of his head. Hair and all sloped up like spaghetti. It looked almost serene, like a grazing antelope.
Excuse me, miss?
The operator repeated.
Can you see them?
Yes, I whispered, breathlessly. Yes, I do.
Is everybody alright?
Noah looked up at me with complete disinterest. For a moment his eyes met mine, and he was as calm as ever. There was no panic, no regret, nothing. Like a dog enjoying a meaty bone. No! I wheezed back into the phone. No! We're not alright! Yes, he'd killed and eaten that man. The moment we got off the bus, the first thing he'd done was to kill and eat him. No hesitation whatsoever. For a good 15 minutes, I just stood there, watching. The police were on their way, but this was the bit of the way. Noah didn't seem to mind an audience. He just bit, chewed, and swallowed. Bit, chewed, and swallowed. Then spurts of blood stained his horn-rimmed glasses. But I couldn't move or look away. I couldn't bring myself to move or turn my back on him. I was just frozen. The moment the police arrived, they didn't even pull out their guns. They just stood there, staring in disbelief. Putting Noah in handcuffs and taking him away was completely uneventful. There was no struggle, no sudden attacks, nothing. Noah just looked disappointed to have his meal taken away, like a child tiredly reaching for his teddy bear. I was so distraught after stating my witness account that I forgot one of my bags. I just took the one closest to me and got out of there. Couldn't bring myself to call on my friends. I crashed the first night at a hotel I came across. I sat up all night, staring into the ceiling, still trying to make some kind of sense at what I had seen. I didn't notice myself crying, and I didn't notice how those cries slowly turned into screams. I just lay there, head empty, screaming into a cheap, tear-stained motel pillow. Over the following weeks, I settled into a new place, a new job, a new life. Everything was different, but in ways I hadn't anticipated. I felt like an alien, as if the world had shifted, like I'd been something not of this earth. Some of the most mundane things felt strange. Eating a sesame seed bagel at a cafe down on the corner felt like ashes in my mouth. All I could think about was teeth, tearing, ripping, curious eyes looking my way. But looking past all that, there was something else that kept crawling back into my mind. Just how awful I was at judging someone's character. How I hadn't noticed the scam my ex had been wrapped up in, costing us our savings. How I hadn't noticed how I was neglecting my work at the point where they had to let me go. And now this. How I couldn't see that the friendly Noah on the bus had been ready to eat a living person at the drop of a hat. It didn't add up to me. How do you miss something like that? I was one of the witnesses called to the trial that followed. I hoped it'd be a chance to finally put it all behind me. I said my piece, and I stayed to watch the proceedings. I had to know more about this man, and what turned him into this monster. He didn't look like a monster though. He was just a man in a suit. He even had the same glasses. I couldn't look past his friendly demeanor. Still, as unbothered by this whole situation as the day I saw him bite down the flesh. There was a clinical psychiatrist called to the stand. He'd been there to assess Noah's mental state and was ready to share his findings. Mr. Anton is deeply confused, he said. To him, his behavior is nothing new. This is something he's been forced to do for years in order to survive. Is he confessing further crimes? Yes, the psychologist continued, but Mr. Anton has left perception of reality. He speaks of living in the forest, hunting people for food. He has no memory of ever having a family or an occupation. To him, his life has been about inhuman acts, fraught but never-ending strife. And you assess this as the belief is genuine response to trauma? Yes, his belief is genuine, the psychiatrist agreed. This man has suffered great trauma. There was a short pause as the psychologist checked his notes and adjusted his glasses. It's as he believes he's come from a different world. In Noah's mind, he'd been a murderer for years, trapped in a sort of limbo state. His description of the world was horrifying, living in a space of ruptured reality. There were only certainty, was famine and pain. He'd taken refuge in what he believed to be the shell of an abandoned bus. Suddenly, there was intruders in his space, one of which he killed and ate. The other he didn't mind since he was already having his fill. According to his testimony, he was even willing to share. He wanted to be a good host. His family spoke of another story to them. Noah was a kind man with a busy schedule. There were pictures of him coaching his son's basketball team. He'd recently celebrated 30 years of marriage for his wife, which he loved dearly. To them, this was an unreal nightmare. There was nothing in his history pointing to this kind of madness. Something happened, they said. Something must have happened on the bus. I hate to admit it, but I agreed. It just didn't make sense. I'm not sure what happened to Noah. There's a lot of talk behind closed doors, and most of what was said stayed there. The papers didn't say a lot about it. There was a mention of a case of mutilation, but every report about it was vague. It's as if no one really wanted to report it. Maybe they didn't know it was a case of mental illness or something more sinister. Either way, there wasn't much said about it. I tried to pick it out of my head. I caught up with my unread DMs. I'd been dreading reading worried texts, demands on unpaid bills, whatever else might kick me further while I was down. I couldn't go back to the world just yet, but I sort of had to. But that's where things took another turn. I didn't recognize these messages, unknown names and numbers, asking me to call them back. One begged me to reconsider. Another sent me an address and a name. All kinds of strange, even coded messages. Also bank accounts, payments. That made me pause. I had no idea who these people were, or what they wanted from me. Had they gotten the wrong number? I remember my second bag. I'd only brought the one, which I'd stashed away in the bathroom. I hadn't opened it since that night. And the second bag, well, I still hadn't talked to the police about it. But I decided that before I did anything else, I ought to at least unpack what little I'd bought. Even though it might be stained with blood or worse, I couldn't bear the thought of it. But opening the bag, well, there was nothing of the sort in it. It was my bag. I was certain of it. But there were no clothes or keepsakes. Instead, it had syringes wrapped in leather casings, little clear vials unmarked, sheets of plastic, bags, duct tape and knives, several knives, all of various sizes, all sharpened to perfection. I picked one up. It fit perfectly into my hand, as if made for me. Looking up at the bathroom mirror, there was something about the image looking back at me that I couldn't recognize. While I could feel a frown forming on my brow, the face looking at me had a creeping smirk, and I saw it blink. That was only the beginning. Police didn't have my second bag. There had never been a second bag. There was only the one bag, and I couldn't recognize a thing in it. Even stranger, I couldn't get in touch with anyone I knew. All numbers seemed to be out of commission. My parents, my sister, my friends, none of them. I couldn't call them or find their social media profiles. In my bag there was a wallet, several fake IDs, and thousands of dollars in cash. I couldn't recognize the presidents on the bill. With every revelation, the smirk on my mirror image deepened. It would tilt its head the other way. It looked up and down, observing me. I'd raise my hands towards it, and it wouldn't return the gesture. Once, when I was in the bathroom, the bulb went out. I was standing there, fresh out of the shower, in complete darkness. I wrapped my cold towel around me, and I heard something. It sounded like a distant echo of my own voice, as if spoken from the other side of the window. "Closer," it whispered. I didn't say anything. I just held my breath and listened. "I'm lost," it continued. "Coming home." A finger brushed against my hair. I recoiled, and so did something else. I heard footsteps moving away. As I opened the bathroom door and let some light in, The mirror image was nothing out of the ordinary, but somewhere out there, in the dark, I heard waning footsteps. With every message I received, it was becoming increasingly clear that people were expecting something of me. That I'd move somewhere, meet someone, do something. I was asked about my equipment, about places and times. There were also a handful of threats from people expressing disappointment. There was a knock on the door once. Another time, I saw a car slowing down to watch me through the kitchen window. There were mysterious phone calls at night, and whenever I stepped into a dark room, I'd stay clear of mirrors. If I stepped too close, I could hear something moving in there. Footsteps, irregular breaths. Sometimes I'd feel the warmth of something reaching for me, skin just inches away, then a hasty retreat. I decided to retrace my steps. After all, Noah Anton had been a family man before he swerved off the road. But what the hell had I been? Maybe he wasn't the only one who changed. I rented a car and took to the highway. I was having trouble navigating, ending up down a couple of crossroads I wasn't supposed to. When I finally began to recognize where I was meant to go, the sun was already setting. I didn't care. I was ready to drive through the night if need be. The first rain spatter came as soon as the sun set. The wind was picking up. I didn't dare to look in the rear mirror. I didn't want to think about what I might see. I don't know how long I drove. After a while, I stopped seeing other cars on the road. Then a shadow. Someone in the middle of the road. A boy? I stepped on the brakes. A couple of moths thumbed against my windshield as my car came to a full stop. I caught a glance at the side view mirror, only to see hands reaching out. I blinked it away. I got out of my car, looking back down the road. I could still see the silhouette of a boy walking away. Just like that night when the bus swerved off the road. This had to be connected. It just had to. I left my car running by the side of the road. "Wait!" I called out. "Hold on!" He didn't stop. I was catching up, but as it turns out, I wasn't the only one. As I got closer, other figures emerged from the rain. Some of them looked like me, others only held a vague resemblance. A selected few were identical. Further out, there were other figures, some impossibly tall, others barely even human. We all looked at one another, our heads turning in unison, left, right, left, like a ripple of thought, forcing us all down the same collective impulse. "I want my knives back." A voice breaking through the rain. I didn't have to turn around to know who it was. I'd seen her in the mirror dozens of times by now, but this time her voice was unhindered. There was no mirror in the way. I could feel her staring at me. We were all spread out in a circle around the mysterious boy. A sort of beacon. We'd all gathered around. And the closer we got, the stranger things became. I lost track of time. I could barely feel the weight of the heartbeats as they quickened and slowed seemingly at random. The wind picked up, then disappeared, then reappeared. Rain to snow to hail to summer shine. In one blink of an eye, the world was on fire. In another, we were standing in oncoming traffic, cars throwing themselves off the road to avoid us. In one place, the stars were gone, and the ground was nothing but black sand. In so many places, there was nothing left. No life, no sky, nothing. It was terrifying. I wanted to turn around and run, but I couldn't trust the figure to my side not to take advantage. Instead, I stopped. A few moved closer, only to dissipate or be changed forever. One sprouted a third arm. Another was dragged into the dark by an unseen force. One fell to the ground, stretched and bent like hot metal. Screams, cries, and hysterical laughter. Slowly the boy moved away, and with every step he took, I could feel my world slowing down. By the time I could feel the rain on my skin again, there was a hand on my shoulder. I was grabbed, spun around, pushed. In front of me, my twisted mirror image. "Go home," it hissed. "I'm done with this place." A push, shadows groaning in distance, and the rain growing stronger. A different rain. There was an unknown car waiting by the side of the road. One more neatly parked, similar to the one I'd used, but not the same. Going through the glove box, I recognized several items. Looking in the back seat, there were 2 familiar bags. I realized what had happened. I'd been gone, and now I'd been returned. I've been back here for quite some time now. Here, where Noah Anton is an ordinary family man, without any articles mentioning his name. I settled into my new place, and eventually got a new job. Got back in touch with my family and friends. I started to recognize the faces of my dollar bills again. But a few things have happened. No one has seen my ex for a while. There was a string of disappearances around the area where I used to live back in Cleveland. I don't like to think about it, or more about what happened. Am I responsible? If not, who is? I'm not sure what happened that night. Not really. I think we got too close to something we shouldn't, and what little sense we make of the world got mixed up. I can't help but to look a little bit longer at mirrors. I lean my ear in to listen, making sure I don't hear anything. I turn my head back and forth, making sure the image follows. So far it does, but I sometimes get the sense that it doesn't. Maybe in the dark when I can't look as closely. If you find yourself near a strange sunflower field, keep your eyes on the road, slow down. And if you do get a little too close, watch your surroundings, check your bills, and in more ways than one, know your place.
I was moved from county jail in October of 2016, following my conviction for armed robbery. I'm not here to garner sympathy, but I want to be clear on a couple of things. This was an unfair sentence, and I know, not in the usual innocent man put in jail type of schlock, but in the way that they were clearly pushing me towards being put in a particular jail. I had my blood tested, and my hair was sent to a lab. They took pictures of my fingernails. I'd never seen anything like it, but I was basically catatonic. I was in a bad place, wanted it all just to be over. At the time, I didn't think much about the processing. I didn't think about the records that were passed between the guards and doctors, and I didn't care much about the blue rubber stamps that were put on the base of every signed legal document. I didn't know what was normal and what wasn't. I just wanted to get into the haze and no brain the next 6 or so years away. I was put in a cell with Lion Soon, a Chinese-American man. To this day, I don't have the slightest idea of what he was in for. Guy looked like your average college kid, but there was just something about him. He just had this look of complete disassociation. Like he was miles away, he never really looked at you. It was as if he looked straight through you. Then again, a lot of the inmates get that. I barely managed to talk to him in the first few days. We agree that I took the top bunk, but that was pretty much all we managed to talk about. We had a straightforward schedule, breakfast and work up till 11, lunch, more work, some yard time, dinner. After that, we either go to or specialized programming times, religious services, NA, anger management, you know the stick, or an extra hour in the yard if you're lucky. Then back into the cell, lights out by 11. In my first few days, I had to go through a lot of orientation. They were the kind of who's who introductions you might expect, but also just someone pointing to which shelf they stock a detergent. Basic stuff. I got a job cleaning the beddings. They were so cheap and firm enough poke would go right through them like a piece of paper. Washing them was basically putting them in a shredder. We had to go on such a low setting that they rarely even got clean. I swear I saw a cockroach in one of the pillowcases once, and the damn thing was still alive after the wash and dry. The pillows were also crap. They ripped easily, the feathers would get stuck to everything. Probably wasn't the room in this whole facility without feathers littering the floor. Hell, they were even in the yard. Most of them were, in fact. We had rotating schedules, so I rarely got to work with the same people 2 days in a row. I started to recognize a few faces, but people mostly kept to themselves. There was no locker room talk, no brag rats, no bravado, just people hunkering down and shutting up doing their time. But even early on I noticed something was off. I think it all came down to the yard. That dreaded yard. People stayed away from the prison yard. No one used the exercise equipment. People just stuck to the walls or silently walked by the fences. There were no loud conversations, no sports, nothing. And as soon as the free hour was up, people were pushing to get back in. From day one, I got the impression that the yard was a bad place to be, but no one was telling me why. What kind of prison has dust on a free weights? By the end of the week, I had started to get into the routine. I was out cold by 10 most nights. Hell, I had the bedding with the least holes in them. Might as well use that luxury. But there was one night when I just couldn't sleep. I'd lay down and then all of a sudden, I'd be wide awake again. There was this whistling wind that came down the hall, and it just kept echoing in the back of my head. At first it was a wind, then a whistle, and with no other sound around, it kept growing in my head until it sounded like a goddamn fire truck siren. I'd push my hands against my ears, cover my head in a pillow, but it didn't do a thing. Finally, I just started to mutter to myself, just to fill the air with some other noise. "Please stop," I'd whisper, "please stop." And the funny thing, it did. It actually stopped. The next day I was exhausted. I kept nodding off breakfast, lunch, dinner, pretty much any time I could sit down. The guards would push me awake. The other inmates just sort of stared at me. Some of them actually avoided me, like there was something wrong with me. When it was time for the yard, the guards took me aside and asked me to help clean the common area. No yard time for me. Gotta sweep some feathers. That night I went to bed as soon as I could, but the moment my head hit the pillow, I was wide awake again. And down through the hall, there was that howling wind. There was no way for me to sleep. The sound just kept growing, and all my tiredness was just gone. Whispering don't work anymore. I had to speak out loud. Around midnight, I was still awake. I was just lying there, talking to myself, putting words to the random thoughts in the back of my head to keep my mind occupied. Anything to drown out the awful droning noise outside. I couldn't let it grow further. It was like trying to stop a ship from sinking, one bucket of water at a time. I don't have the slightest idea how Leon tolerated it. He just didn't say a word. Things just got worse. I couldn't sleep the entire night, so when it was time to get up, I could barely stand. I fell asleep brushing my teeth, dropping my toothbrush in the sink. I was so used to talking to myself that by then it was just a blur of whatever came to mind. I was sleeping deprived, exhausted, and just confused, and people were starting to take notice. There was this one guy, Marlon, who was about as new as I was. Short, athletic guy who was just itching for a fight. I accidentally bumped into him in the lunch queue, and he went off on me, pushed me out of the line, bashed me over the face with a tray, and just started wailing on me. The guards were taking their sweet time, so I just had to take it, getting hit, punched, and kicked repeatedly. But I couldn't. There was just something in me that wanted to hurt this guy. I grabbed his shirt and looked him in the eyes. "You want to get whipped, Greenie?" I said. "You want us to whip you?" I don't know where the words came from. It was just the first thing that came to mind, and the sleep deprivation just forced it out of my mouth like a hiccup. What did you say?" he stammered. I asked if you little greenie wanted a whipping. He backed off. His jaw went slack as he just stared at me, unblinking. Just as I found the words out of nowhere, he'd lost them. His eyes teared up as he backed himself up against the wall. The prison guards came up to restrain us, and I could see all the fight had run out of him. See you out in the orchard, Greenie, I added. Whip, whip. Marlon broke down. He screamed, tears running out of his eyes. He dropped to the floor, and the guards had to carry him out. I thought I'd feel good after that, but the way everyone was staring at me made me feel like a museum exhibit. I had this thickening, wide smile painted on my face, but it wasn't mine. None of this was me. I was losing control, and it scared the hell out of me. I was a mere puppet. That night, I didn't even bother trying to sleep. I knew as soon as I'd laid down to try, I'd just be wide awake again. Instead, I tried sleeping on my feet, or sitting on the floor. This time, Leon couldn't ignore me. He sat up on his bed, looking at me instead of through me. You want something? He asked. You itching? Nah, I said, shaking my head. Just broken. Something's not right. You're phobic? Trouble with the walls? Maybe, I don't know, I can't sleep. Looks like you sleep all the time, just not in here. Yeah, I sighed. Yeah, that sounds about right. They stamp you when you get here? You got any stamps? Some, yeah, blue ones. Everyone gets the blue ones. What shape? Don't know, I shrugged. Leon took a long look at me. In those few dredging seconds, I could hear the wind outside growing louder, and I winced. I groaned to drown out the noise, but it was barely working. I might have screamed to keep it together for another night. They got 2 stamps, he said. A hand and a sunflower. You sure you don't know which one you got? Which did you get? I asked. What do you mean? I got the hand, he said. Most of us did. No idea what it means. But the sunflowers are always a bit, pointed at me as to make a point. Maladaptive. Private prisons, I chuckled. Bullshit, all of it. Leon leaned back in his bed and closed his eyes. Yeah, he sighed. Sewing us into flowers and hands like a goddamn daycare. Probably good woodchuck and dolphin stamp too. Leon was out like a light, but as expected, I couldn't sleep. I paced back and forth, screaming into a pillow, and tried massaging my ears. The scratching noise sort of helped, but I still found myself restless. Finally, I got out of bed and pressed my head against the door. Maybe if I let the wind howl, it would take pity on me. Maybe it would get to a point where it'd either kill me or stop. I didn't care which, as long as something happened. But the strangest thing came to me as I pressed my head against the door. The sound became clearer, the wind softened to a whistle, and then a gentle hum. And more I tried to lean into it, to listen, the more beautiful it became. Right there, leaning against the door, I had the best sleep of my entire life. The next morning, Leon pulled me up as the guards did their rounds. I'd slept all through the night, and I felt amazing. But even then and there, at my best, I could hear a little piercing sound. That wind, that whisper, was still in the back of my mind, even now during daytime. But all I had to do was lean into it, to listen, and a wave of calm would wash over me. It worried me how easy it was. You go through it? Leon asked. I'm getting there. I wasn't paying much attention during breakfast. I was zoned out listening to what had turned into a melody. Something was speaking to me, but not through words, through emotions and sensation. So it wasn't a word that warned me about Marlon creeping up on me with a sharpened toothbrush. It wasn't the guards or the other inmates. No, it was something in the back of my mind, screaming at me to hurt him. So I did. All I heard was laughter. There was this alien joy springing up in my chest, forcing me to my feet. I remember turning around and the world looking different. I felt 4 feet taller. I was looking into Marlon's eyes, but I didn't see him. I saw a teenage kid running through an orchard, hunted by his older brothers who wanted to beat him with a tire iron. Whip, whip! When I came to, I was still laughing. It wasn't my own laugh, and neither was the joy. The howling wind was finally quiet, but I felt like a stranger in my own body. I couldn't feel my limbs, and it took me seconds just to orientate myself, to remember my fingers, my feet, my eyes. Marlon was bleeding on the floor from a dozen wounds, deep bruising, broken bones, possibly brain damage from repeated hits to the side of the head, involuntary twitching like a fish out of water, his mouth opening and closing like me. He just couldn't find the words. It looked like I'd beaten him with a goddamn tire iron. I wasn't back to my cell without a word. Paraded through the halls like a prize, I could feel the other inmates staring at me, trying to figure me out. As soon as I looked their way, I saw them recoil in fear. I don't know what the hell they'd seen, but they were looking at me like a goddamn monster. I was locked in my cell for hours. No one was allowed in, and all the while I kept hearing something in the back of my head, singing to me, asking me to listen just a little closer. And as soon as I realized that the noise turned to pain once I resisted, I had no choice. Within minutes, I was pacing the cell, spewing whatever nonsense came flooding through my mind. Nonsense that everything and everyone, just noise. When the guards finally opened the door, I turned to them without skipping a beat. They had their tasers at the ready. "Deb doesn't know that Eddie's really your son," I rambled. "You think he was premature? But she had that time with Urban at her job the month before. She thinks about telling you, but she thinks that might just be a push you need to finally divorce her." A taser to the neck, and I didn't even feel it. As I dropped to the floor in a spasm, my body was screaming with laughter. "He had her own copier. She didn't even think about you. She hoped to see him there again and next week." And there, somewhere deep inside, I found my own thoughts and words, standing by as someone else held the reins. I wanted to tear my ears out, to make it all go away, but I couldn't even move my hands. I'd listened too long and too closely, and now the guards were dragging me by the neck. They took me out to the yard. I heard them talking. They were standing next to me, carrying me, but it still sounded like they were in another room. I could barely make out their voices. "Hatchman mixed up the blood works," he said. "Got the wrong class. Shit, we got a bloomer? We had a bloomer this whole time? It's a goddamn Christmas miracle we didn't pop his Sealy. So why are we taking him out? Just making sure. Protocol, I guess." "Fuck protocol. Fuck off." They left me in the middle of the yard, lining up in a circle around me. The guard I'd been yelling at stayed inside, weeping over a picture. After a few minutes, I felt a tingle in my hands. It felt like being poured back into my own body, like my mind was a liquid. It all came back to me, one thing at a time. Language, memory, senses, choice. Suddenly I was standing up. The wind was clearer out in the open. It was colder than expected, and I wasn't even wearing shoes. There was a stillness in the air, but there was something menacing to it, like the eye of the storm. "Nothing's happening," I heard. "We take him in. Hold on, look up." From afar, it looked like snow. I didn't even question it. Snow in mid-July? Sure, why not? But it wasn't snow. A white feather touched my nose. I looked up in the clouds, and there, far above, I saw something looking back. Can't explain what I felt at that moment. It felt like I was looking into the eye of the sky. An impossible physical being, but there was nothing there, and yet it spoke to me. It spoke through me, like playing a mind game or charades with myself. Pictures flashing in the back of my mind, trying to reach an understanding. Hundreds of memories pounding at the front of my brain every second, like a pitcher being filled to the top and spilling over the edge. I got a nosebleed trying to keep up. My eyes rolled back, but I still felt like I was looking up. It was easier to see with my eyes closed. My mouth seized up from trying to find 1,000 words at once, instead settling for noises and grunts. There were parts that were crystal clear. It showed me memories I didn't know I even had. It showed me my eyes opening for the first time. Little hands grabbing my mother's cardigan. Her big 80s glasses making her eyes look like a cartoon. It showed me up waking in the crib, reaching for the little toys dancing overhead. And I understood what it meant. That we were born with this instinctual drive to reach beyond our means, to stretch towards the sky, to grab and pull down the unknown to us, making it a part of ourselves. That, the most basic instinct of my being, was meant to be here, to do this, to reach up. "No," I wheezed. all was silent. I looked down as I floated 6 feet above the ground.
No,
I groaned. Memories of long-lost dreams came rushing back. Pleasant thoughts you don't want to wake from. Promise of love, lust, joy and comfort. It was all there, just waiting for me to take it. All I had to do was reach for it. To reach into the sky and take it. But there was something more. That eye in the sky looking down at me, not malevolent, not angry, not evil. Just vast beyond comprehension. I was nothing more than a strand of wheat being plucked into the air by a curious farmer.
No!
Running up to me, guards grabbed my legs, pulling me down. It felt like I was being torn in half. Part of me desperately reached upwards, and my consciousness self holding me to the ground. All the while, the pleasant silence was turning from a whisper to a vile scream. "We got it!" a guard yelled as the weather picked up. "Get him out of here! Get him!" Something let go of me. The guard on my left lost his breath as he suddenly went limp. With nothing but a whistle, I saw him whisked into the sky. Not a word of protest, not a sound, just a human life growing smaller and disappearing overhead. I dropped to the ground as they scrambled to get me inside. Another guard fell flat on his stomach as something invisible grabbed his ankles. Again, a soft whistle, and he was gone. A spot in the dark. "Run! Come on!" The other guards were standing by the entrance, holding the doors open. They were wavering at me, desperate for me to just run. But every part of me wanted to stay, to reach up, to touch the sky and go back to that place I was meant to be, to feel my mother's cardigan between my baby soft fingertips, and to look into the sky with no wonder of what could be. It was all there, and yet my body knew I needed to run. The moment I got inside, I heard thumping. Chunks of meat sprayed across the yard, fragments of bone getting stuck in the barbed wire, fabric torn into shreds. Whatever was up there was happy now, and howling wind was silent. We all just stood there. I could barely breathe. I'd been so close to surrendering, to give in to. Whatever was up there had no intention of caring for me. There was no love, no joy, no comfort. All it could promise me was a swift death at the best, or the life of a sleepless puppet. But for a moment we all just stood there. We weren't inmate and prison guard anymore. In that moment we were just people trying to understand ourselves. I got processed the next day. They double-checked my blood. Turns out they'd contaminated my result. Sloppy work from the esteemed people of Hatchet Biotech Mania. This time I saw them clearly stamp my papers. Blue ink in the shape of a little sunflower. I was taken out of state. They said it was a matter of security on account of getting into fights with Marlon. Apparently he'd broken both legs and his shoulder. Still, I knew better. There wasn't a matter of security. This was about fixing a grave mistake. This prison had a purpose, but it wasn't part of what I needed to be. Instead, I did my time in a place with no wind, and now I'm out on parole. To this day, I get a shiver up my spine when I hear the whistling wind. I'm scared of my dreams, of my memories. I'm afraid there's still something in me that wants me to go back, to look up. My psychiatrist, Dr. Bogan, tells me that I've got an agoraphobic trauma to deal with. She says she has some kind of experimental treatment for it, but I don't know. Overexposure therapy sounds dangerous. But even now, I find myself suddenly waking in the middle of the night, my body talking to itself, telling truths I couldn't possibly know to an empty room. Sometimes not even in my own language, sometimes in no language at all. Every now and then, a white feather still lands on my shoulder, and I just know that looking up will be the end of me, or the start.
Back in 2017, I was about 6 months out of an internship with a local law firm. I was a junior legal assistant as part of a retainer team for a statewide biodiesel business. It wasn't my only assignment, but it was the one I was formally hired for. However, during downtime, I was bounced around various teams all throughout the year. It was early February when the call came. The biodiesel place had a new owner, and he wanted to shake things up. Our jobs were safe, but he wanted to make some investments. New manufacturing plants, 2 in Missouri and 1 to the west, within reasonable driving range from their warehouses. The only problem was there were no suitable properties to build on. This could be a multi-million-dollar kind of thing, but we didn't have property to sign off on. That is, until I realized the area they were looking at, my old hometown of Tomskog, Minnesota. I suggested looking into an old property I had gone by 1,000 times on my way to school. It was this massive empty field on the outskirts of town, with nothing but a few rundown houses that could be easily torn down. We knew the place was privately owned, but had no idea who the proprietor was. My boss was ecstatic, to say the least. See, the client had been considering calling the whole thing off, but if we could offer them a property, we could get a fat bonus check along with the finder's fee. It would be enough to take the junior part off of my job title. Since I suggested it, I was given time off to get in touch with the owner of the property. There were some initial problems. The original property documents had been damaged in the flood back in 2014, and only parts of the archive had been digitized. The document I was looking for might not have been digitized yet, and since no immediate documents were available, I was starting to suspect the worst. The clerk at the municipal office promised they'd be back to me with the name within 4 to 8 weeks, 12 at the most. But you know how government buildings work. That was not an option, so I packed my bags, grabbed my cat, and handed it off to my mom. Got the fancy maroon BMW company car, and set my sights on a familiar road. It took me 2 stops for gas and a needlessly complicated detour because of a fallen oak tree. But I made my way to the field just as the sun started to set. After all these years, it was exactly as I remembered. One large, empty property, now covered in mud, stained in February snow, a rundown barn at the edge of the property, and a small 1-story log cabin right next door. All roads were overgrown, and there were no discernible paths out there. I considered going back in the morning, but I figured I had some time left. Maybe there was a big plaque with the name of the owner out front. If so, I could have it all settled in a day and be on my way home before I even had the time to unpack. It was getting late, and the shadows were growing longer, but I was willing to roll those dice. I double-checked my phone, got the flashlight from the trunk, and locked my car. The snow was deep enough to reach my knees. My fancy shoes felt like paper. The cold went straight through. Still, I pushed on, leaning straight across the field. I severely overestimated how much of time I had left. By the time I got to the cabin, it was already getting dark. Using the flashlight, I took a quick lap around the place, just to make sure I wasn't walking into some kind of hillbilly trap room. It didn't take too long for me to realize that this place had been abandoned for years. Not only was it boarded up, but the boards used were rotten. That the place was standing at all was nothing short of a miracle. I tried knocking a little just to make sure no one was home, but I wasn't holding my breath. The place was desolate. I looked for some kind of name or plaque, or hell, something carved into the wall somewhere. Anything, but there really was nothing. I considered coming back in the morning, but I could see dark clouds on the horizon, and I didn't want to walk through the snow more times than necessary. I decided I'd do a little urban exploring. After all, if the door was open, it wouldn't hurt to have a peek inside. Walking up to the door, I noticed something strange. There was a carving at the top of the door frame. Word by word, my flashlight revealed the full sentence.
No one has ever lived in this house.
I tried to wrap my brain around it. Didn't make much sense. What the hell did that even mean? Of course someone had lived here. Someone built it, didn't they? And someone owned the property. Why would there be a house in the middle of nowhere that no one had ever lived in? I hesitated. Something told me to just walk away and come back in the morning, but the clouds on the horizon and my freezing feet were telling me otherwise. There was a carving that meant someone had the habit of leaving messages. Chances were there might be more to them inside. Twiddling the handle a little, I noticed the door was unlocked. So in I went. The cabin had a very basic layout. There was one large room with a wooden bench facing a simple fireplace. There were 2 handmade tables, and the west-facing wall was lined with dried herbs, mostly blue and black. There was a surprisingly clean cowskin on the floor, as well as a small door on the eastmost side of the room, leading to the kitchen. It was mostly just an antique kind of stove and a couple of cabinets, but whoever lived there must have been accustomed to the sparse lifestyle. But no, that wasn't it. I had to correct myself. The carving said no one had ever lived here. Then why the furniture? I decided to ignore the message for the time being, instead focusing on finding the name of whoever owned the place. There might be some initials on the handmade furniture. I gently moved the bench and tables first, going over them with my flashlight. There were no obvious markings, but another problem quickly arose. My flashlight was giving up on me. It started to flicker. Looking around, I could see no more possible source of light but the old fireplace, and I couldn't imagine that thing not being clogged. Then again, there was firewood, and I did have a lighter. I quit smoking about 2 years prior, but I always kept it around, just in case. You know, old Boy Scout tradition. Breaking off a piece of a bark and lighting it, I double-checked to make sure that the smoke cleared and went up. Surprisingly, it did. Glancing at my phone, I figured I could use for the flashlight as well, but I didn't want to drain the battery. Instead, I lit a fire and left the door open, just in case the smoke didn't entirely clear out. Carbon monoxide poisoning ain't a joke. As the fire sputtered to life, I sat down to take a breather on the bench. It was a pretty cozy little cabin, the kind of place you'd stay in a night or two when going fishing. I could imagine my dad warming his hands by the fire. I lost him in 2010, but that was the kind of place he'd always been most at home. As I warmed my hands, watching my shadows grow longer, I could imagine him sitting next to me. I could almost hear him, and in that moment my eyes drifted to a space right in front of a fireplace, a space where a small iron plate protected the floor. I didn't know what drove me to look closer, but I realized there were no screws or nails keeping that plate down. So with a quick touch of a fire poker, it came loose, revealing a sort of makeshift metal box. There were 4 items in total inside: a broken pocket watch, an empty hip flask, 3 spent shotgun shells, and a small journal. I went straight for the journal, checking for a name. It was getting darker outside, so I huddled around the fireplace. As snow began to tap against the wooden barricades, I had 2 choices: to steal the journal or to read it by the fire as the storm raged on. It was my cold feet that decided for me. I took off my shoes and warmed them by the fire. As I started to slowly read my way through the rough, curved text of the journal, not the kind of job I'd imagine I'd be on doing from a law firm, but things never quite go the way you planned. I opened the first page, hoping to find a name. Instead, I was greeted by a strange text. Journal written by. Then nothing. That was it. No name. Just that. I turned the book over, back and forth. No name anywhere. I turned the book over, back and forth. No name anywhere. I kept reading. The first page reads as follows. I once had a name and a creed. A couple of truths thrown to the grave long before my end. Now I remain battered and empty. My history is unusual, as my mind turns sun-bleached and distant. My heart burns of wrath, but I cannot recall as to why. I turned the page. I couldn't help but be intrigued, if not for any other reason than to find a name of the author. This house is not my property, and to my recollection, no one has ever lived here. He proceeded to discuss at length the part of his history that he had remembered. Growing up in Wisconsin, being the son of a shoemaker, little adolescence of a long life. His first kiss, his first love, his first house. But the further along he tried to remember, the foggier it got. I was starting to think I might never find a name, but I wasn't sure why. At some point, the author recalled something happening. He couldn't explain what, or why, or where. But he could recall something upsetting his routine. Something came to him, and it made him upset. He spoke about putting up barricades, keeping a loaded shotgun at the ready, and locking himself in for days on end.
It might have been here that I made my stand, he wrote. It could be, it should be, but I can't say that it was.
He would go on and detail some sort of a struggle, but he couldn't picture what it was against. The text was so strangely written, I could tell there were segments as if written piece by piece, but it wasn't possible to tell just how much time had passed between them. Even in the journal, the author laminated on large segments of time randomly missing. I couldn't help but to consider the other items in the box, in particular the spent shotgun shells. The author proceeded to explain how he'd broken the pocket watch, as it frustrated him. He was losing track of time. He might think 10 minutes had passed, only to realize the entire afternoon was gone. He broke his watch as a reminder that he couldn't trust himself anymore.
Maybe I'll remember that, he wrote. Or will the watch unbreak itself?
It was disrupted from my read by a sudden noise. Looking up, I could see the fire was dying out, but the sound actually came from my phone. Turns out it was my automated time to go to bed alert. I'd been sitting there for 6 hours. That didn't make sense. I stood up, clutching the journal. There was nothing here. The cabin was empty. But I couldn't escape this sudden sense of dread, like something awful had just happened. But I couldn't say exactly what. Looking down on the journal, I suddenly realized that I felt exactly as described by the author. I felt this unexplainable anxiousness, like the uneasy feeling you get when you feel that someone is watching you, only more palpable. Standing up with my back to the fireplace, I continued reading. He continued to explain how his flask was empty, but he couldn't remember drinking from it. He detailed his plans to conceal a few items, along with his journal, for an entire day just to see if he could remember to retrieve it.
But not yet, he said. There are trespassers to deal with.
This was where his spent shells came into play. The author revealed how he'd found a group of strange trespassers. He'd taken them all out with his shotgun. He wrote in detail about shooting 3 times, but that he couldn't remember anything about them, men, women, or children. There was no way to tell.
I buried them in my barn, he detailed. It seemed like the right thing to do. Why am I crying?
As the journal neared its end, the author tried to summarize his remaining thoughts. Something came to him. Wherever he was, it did something, and as a result, everything was destroyed. He was devastated, but couldn't even remember why. It was like muscle memory. Something in his body was remembering the sadness.
I inscribe upon this door, he wrote, that no one has ever lived here. I do not recall this place, or anything living here. It serves as a warning and a reminder that this is not my home.
And with the final page, the author documented putting it all in a sort of hidden lockbox in front of the fire. He would do so for one day to see if he could remember retrieving it. Evidently, he couldn't. With the final words on the final page, he gave one last piece of insight, perhaps in a moment of clarity.
It started with when I lit the fire, he wrote. Everything turned worse after I lit the fire.
Looking back at the fireplace and sputtering logs, I slowly came to the realization of what kind of situation I'd put myself in.
I had accidentally followed the footsteps of a man who used to be in that cabin. A man that might have owned it, but couldn't even remember it. Or who knows, maybe he was just passing by. I decided to take my chances and just leave. I brought the journal along, opened the door, and prepared to brave the weather. But something happened, right then and there. Something made me stop, and I just stood there. I stood there long enough for my hands to turn blue, and I only suddenly snapped out of it when a snowflake hit my eye. I wasn't alone. There was something there, and it's doing something to me. I had rang the damn dinner bell. Thinking about it, it feels a bit like being eaten alive. Not physically, but the same feeling remains. This heedless consumption, something taking an inanimate part of what makes you into you and tearing it away. That's what I still remember. That's what it feels like. But it is hard to explain something I can't remember. It feels like a void in your mind, but you have the instinct to fill it with something bad, like watching a scary movie and knowing something horrifying is about to pop up. Every time I think about it, trying to picture it in my mind, I get the same feeling. Sometimes my mind fills up with all sorts of organic darkness, roughly shaped as a person. Other times, it's just some guy. It changes whenever I look back at it, because there's nothing there for me to remember, so my mind fills in the blanks. But who's to say that all those blanks are false? I turned around and realized I'd been exposed to this thing. It was doing something to me, and it was bad enough to make me run headfirst into the dark. Looking back at this, all I really remember feeling was an immense panic, a prey of reflex, like trying to escape a wild animal. I ended up in the old barn, where I hid behind a mound of debris next to one of the collapsed walls. My fingers were freezing, but I was going to call for help, no matter what. Only problem was I couldn't remember the code to unlock my phone. I tried, but between my fingers being so cold to register anything and the unfathomable approaching from just around the corner, I decided it was better to hunker down and be quiet. Because, while I can't remember anything about the physical features of it, I remember thinking it wasn't very perceptive for some reason. It passed me by, but I couldn't make any sounds without revealing my position. Calling for help was out of the question. Instead, I turned my attention back to the journal. My lock screen had a bright picture blurred in the background, allowing me to use it as a makeshift mini flashlight of sorts. For some reason, I wasn't afraid that the creature would spot me visually. Perhaps it didn't have eyes. I turned the pages back and forth, looking for a particular segment. There was something about a weapon the author had used to deal with the intruders that left me wondering. But I could barely make out anything in the journal, between my heart pounding, my freezing hands, and the strange thing lurking about. I couldn't make heads or tails of the damned cursive text. Can't remember what kind of sounds that creature made, but I can remember the sounds the environment made when it passed. I remember wood splintering as something climbed the trees. I remember creaking wood from a sudden weight coming down. I remember splintering as it was torn from its hinges. Finally, I found the page I was looking for, just after talking about how he didn't know why he was sad about killing the intruders. The author wrote, "I threw the damn thing into the hayloft. I have not been able to retrieve it, as the memory of its shape eludes me. How does one recognize a weapon that one has no recollection of ever wielding?" I waited for the entity to step outside before I made my way upstairs. It is a strange feeling, trying to balance the instinct to run with the obsessive thought of staying quiet. Every creaking floor sent shivers down my spine, curling my toes in anticipation of something running me down. But nothing happened. It didn't take long for me to find it, an old double-barrel hunting rifle. Looking over it, I saw that there was some sort of shell still loaded. Perhaps it worked, perhaps not. I was no expert, and I didn't have much of a choice but to try. I'd be a sitting duck out there without it. After all, I couldn't remember where I parked my car.
I decided to go on the offensive. I made my way down the stairs a little too quick. Before long I heard the scurrying noise. And something entered the old barn. I remember standing a good 15 feet away from it, and raising the weapon towards it. It stopped, but so did I. For a while we just sort of circled one another. I remember my movement being in response to a threat. "Do you? Is this eat or play?" I asked. "Is this you eating?" I bet all of those memories disappear after a while, digested. Then you wouldn't remember what this is, or what it does. But you do, don't you? I remember tapping the rifle for emphasis. There was a long pause, but I can't remember why. Did it respond? Could it talk? If you're really just playing, then you might remember that this thing is loaded, I continued, and you might know what it does. You saw what happened when he used it. You heard it. A shorter pause. We stopped circling. I gripped the weapon tighter and stepped forward, advancing. If this was a consumer, and it worked in any way like we do, it would absorb and convert what it fed on into some sort of nutrient. But if it was just collecting for some reason, then it would have this archive of thoughts to recollect from. That was my reasoning. Or maybe it was just clever. Maybe it was just as clever as I was. I made my way back outside. Even though in the newly fallen snow, I managed to find what remained of the path I'd made when I first got there. I walked backwards down the path, my rifle steadily aimed at it. At something. I didn't want to pull the trigger. If I misfired or missed, I was dead. Just having the means of defending myself was enough to keep it away for now. I think it had left some sort of toxin in me. Despite not being anywhere near me, I still felt the effects of it. I kept falling into a sort of fugue state, getting turned around and losing grip of where I was going and why. At some point I was just standing there, gawking at the dark, as my rifle thumped to the ground. But there in the dark, a memory surfaced. The memory I'd felt back at the cabin. Thoughts of my dad taking me fishing. Back then, we'd worn rubber boots, and instead of snow, there was mud. It was still deep, and I had to walk the same way I did in the snow, but that's what triggered the memory to begin with. I tried to keep that image in my head, the anticipation as we gathered our bait, learning how to tie proper knot, getting the correct measurements for the distance between the hook, the weight, and the bobber. I could almost hear the spinning fishing line as the red and white bobber sailed across the lake. Just holding on to something I knew I couldn't forget was all I needed. It became this sort of bedrock, keeping me from completely losing my mind and focus. I could keep going, holding on to something I knew to be true. It was the backstop, keeping me from losing track. I grabbed the rifle and pressed on. As I did, I remember something rustling in the nearby trees, retreating into the woods. By the time I made it back to my car, the toxin had completely taken hold of me. At that point, I had little to nothing to hold on to, but for a few cherished memories. I crawled into my car, locked all the doors, and tucked myself into a fetal position, in the back seat, still clutching the rifle. My body didn't know how to react. I was hot, I was cold, wide awake, and deeply unconscious, all seemingly at random. I would lose my sense of object permanence, bobbing my head back and forth, completely forgetting what I was doing and what was even happening. At one point something made the passenger door creak. Maybe someone tried to open it. Luckily all the doors were locked and I had the keys. I remember laying back in the car seat, raising the rifle. Then there was a pause, a long one. Something made me shake my head. It made me angry and afraid, very afraid. It left me with the sense of a rabbit being stared down by a pack of wolves. I had something it wanted, something it deeply valued. Again, this creature is just this, nothingness. I can't recall what it looked like, or if it was even a physical being. From context, I think it could talk. I think it said something to me that I didn't want to hear, and to this day, when I think of it, my mind just conjures these otherworldly horrors. teeth, skin, claws. But I didn't lower my rifle, not for a second. I didn't try my luck, and I didn't challenge fate. By the time the sun rose, it was gone, and with it went the sweats, the confusion, and much of the memory voids. First thing I did was check the shotgun shell. Turns out it was already spent, empty. That leaves a lot of questions, uncomfortable ones. If that thing was just collecting, it would have known that I couldn't hurt it. If it knew that, why did it let me go? Did I trade it something? How would I even know? But if it was just feeding, then how it knows to stay away from the rifle? I have managed to put this story together piece by piece. Some of my memories are still a bit touch and go, but this is the most complete retelling I can make. I've tried to fill in as many blanks as I can, but it is hard. I keep the journal. I think I still have it somewhere. I showed it to my boss, but it was a weak comfort. The clients eventually ended up choosing another site, leaving us in an awful position. Needless to say, that trip didn't get me promoted that year. Or years later for that matter. Yeah, I still work there, same firm. I get the feeling that this thing didn't just make people forget things, it made people be forgotten. Despite all my efforts, not a single person I met or talked to can remember anyone ever hearing anything about people who used to live there. Even the clerk at the municipal office kept forgetting I'd even made the request to inquire about the land to begin with. That might have just been laziness though. But I get this feeling that I'm missing something, even though I've wrapped my head around most of this. And most of what happened out there, I often get the feeling that I lost something. In those memories, when everything in the world feels uncertain and half true, I look back at the day with my dad. I listen to the spinning of the fishing line. But here's the thing. This is what bothers me. This is what made me want to post, to kind of save the posterity, like a journal of my own, hidden by my own fireplace. Lately, I can't remember what my dad's eyes looked like, and I'm just forgetting, or is something forgetting it for me?